Claire Parker felt something unusual the moment she woke up, a quiet tension in the air that made her heart beat a little faster. As if the day was waiting to reveal something she wasn't prepared for. She tried to shake off the feeling while making coffee. But the house felt too still without Eric, her husband, who had left before dawn for a business trip after a small disagreement the night before. It wasn't a dramatic fight. It's just one of those tired conversations where two people feel the weight of unspoken fears. And Claire hated how they had let it hang between them. She kept replaying their last few minutes together, hoping she hadn't looked as distant as she felt. She tried reading a book, then cleaning the kitchen, then folding laundry, but nothing calmed her anxious thoughts. She wondered if Eric was already in Toronto, wondered if he was thinking about their unfinished words. Wondered if she should have hugged him before he left. Before she could sink deeper into her thoughts, a firm knock at the door jolted her back to the moment. It wasn't a friendly tap. It sounded urgent, almost heavy. Claire paused, confused, because no one ever came by this early. When she looked through the small window beside the door, she froze. Standing on her front porch were Eric's three closest friends, Daniel, Mark, and Jesse. All three at once. All three looking strangely serious. Her stomach tightened because they never visited without Eric, and certainly not unannounced. She felt her pulse quicken as she opened the door, trying to read their faces, each one showing a different shade of worry. "Claire, can we come in?" Daniel asked, his voice low and steady, but not calm. Claire stepped aside, letting them in, wondering what could possibly explain their sudden appearance. Her mind jumped immediately to the worst possibilities, but she pushed the fear down, refusing to let it take over until someone actually said something. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the room filled with a thick, strange silence. She had known these men for years and trusted them deeply. But today their presence felt heavy, as if they were carrying news they didn't want to share. Jesse was the first to approach her, his eyes softer than usual, almost apologetic. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her even as her breath grew uneven. "Claire," he said, "Eric asked us to come check on you." The wording sent a rush of confusion through her. Why would Eric send them? Why not call her directly? Before she could ask, Mark stepped forward holding a small white envelope. Her heart jumped painfully when she saw her name written across the front in Eric's handwriting. It wasn't neat like usual. It looked rushed, uneven, almost desperate. "He wrote this last night," Mark said quietly. Before he left, Claire felt the air around her tighten as she reached for the envelope, her hands trembling despite trying to stay composed. She didn't want to open it in front of them, but she also couldn't stand not knowing. She slid her finger under the seal, unfolded the paper, and her eyes raced across the words. Eric had written about their argument, how he felt her slipping away, how he feared he wasn't enough lately, how he worried she stayed quiet, not because she was calm, but because she was tired. He wrote that he didn't know how to fix things unless he understood what she needed. But he also didn't know how to ask without sounding insecure. The letter wasn't long, but it felt raw, as if he had poured every tangled feeling out in a rush, hoping she would understand him even when he didn't know how to explain himself. As she read, her throat tightened. She hadn't realized he felt that deeply. She hadn't known he carried so much fear beneath his steady exterior. She looked up at the three men standing in her living room. They all watched her with silent concern, as if waiting for her to break or breathe or run or do anything at all. "He thinks I'm falling out of love with him," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the words. Daniel shook his head gently. "He doesn't think that. He's just scared. You both are. He called us from the airport and said he didn't want to leave things the way they were. He didn't know how to reach you without making things worse," Jessie added. "He asked us to check on you, make sure you weren't alone today." Claire wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by how easily the emotion escaped. But the confusion inside her only grew stronger. If Eric was this worried, why didn't he turn around before boarding? Why send his friends instead of coming back himself? She wasn't angry, just overwhelmed. She felt pulled in two directions, wanting to protect Eric from his own fears, while also wanting him to trust her enough to talk to her face to face. The room felt warm but suffocating, filled with people who cared yet couldn't fix the ache in her chest. Mark stepped closer, speaking gently. He didn't want you thinking you had to handle your feelings alone. He thought we could help until he figured out what to do. Claire swallowed hard. She appreciated their kindness, but part of her still felt a sharp sting. A quiet ache in the space between intention and action. She folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest as if keeping it close might calm the storm inside her. For a moment, no one spoke. The house was so still she could hear her own uneven breathing. And then, when she finally found the courage to look up, ready to ask what Eric planned next, another knock hit the door. This one louder, faster, urgent. Claire's breath caught. The three men exchanged startled glances, none of them expecting anyone else. And in that split second before she reached for the door, before her world shifted, again she felt the sharp, unmistakable sense that whatever waited on the other side was about to change everything even more than the letter had. Asterisk. Claire opened the door with her heart pounding. Still shaken from reading Eric's letter, and the sudden second knock only sharpened her confusion. But when she saw no one outside and realized it had only been a delivery driver dropping off a package for the neighbors, the tension in her chest loosened slightly. She stepped back inside, forcing herself to breathe, and turned toward the three men who were now standing together as if trying to decide how much more she could handle. She didn't blame them. She barely knew how she felt herself. The envelope was still warm from her hands, the ink smudged where her tears had touched it. The letter's weight hadn't faded. If anything, it grew heavier as her mind raced through every line Eric had written. She kept hearing the sentence where he said he didn't know how to talk to her anymore. How he felt her drifting even when she was standing right beside him. She hadn't realized he carried that fear, hadn't known he saw her quiet moments as distance rather than exhaustion. She always thought Eric was the steady one, the one who didn't worry, the one who didn't fall apart. Now she saw how wrong she was. Daniel stepped closer, speaking calmly but quickly, as if he understood that Claire needed clarity before her thoughts spun any further. He explained how Eric had called them from the airport sounding more anxious than they had ever heard him, saying he didn't want to go on the trip but couldn't cancel without causing issues at work. Claire felt a small sting when she imagined him sitting alone at the gate, writing that rushed letter because he didn't know what else to do. Mark added that Eric wasn't trying to hide behind them. He simply didn't want Claire to feel abandoned after their tense goodbye. He thought sending the people she trusted most might help her feel supported while he figured out how to fix things. Claire let out a shaky breath, torn between gratitude and frustration. Because even though she appreciated Eric's intentions, it still hurt that he hadn't come back himself. She wondered if he thought she didn't want him there, or if he simply didn't believe she would listen. Jesse walked toward the kitchen and returned with a glass of water, placing it in her hands like he had done dozens of times during group gatherings when she looked overwhelmed. Claire took a sip, hoping it would steady her, but her chest still felt tight. The living room, usually warm with laughter whenever the four men visited, now felt filled with uncertainty. She sat on the edge of the couch, holding the letter in one hand and the glass in the other, trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. She had woken up thinking she and Eric were just going through a rough week. But now it felt like their entire marriage was at risk, not because of anything dramatic, but because of small misunderstandings that had grown quietly between them. Daniel sat across from her, his tone gentle but firm as he reminded her how much Eric loved her. He said Eric wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was scared of losing the connection they once had, the one they had always protected together. Mark said Eric had confided in them over the last few weeks, not in a dramatic way, but in small comments about missing her closeness, missing their late-night talks, missing the way she used to reach for his hand without thinking. Hearing that made Claire's heart ache, because she hadn't realized how distant she had become. She was tired from work, stressed about life, overwhelmed by things she didn't always talk about. And she never imagined Eric interpreted her silence as slipping away from him. As she listened, she felt the truth settling in her chest, not in a painful way, but in a clarifying one. She loved Eric deeply, but she had stopped showing it in the ways he needed. At the same time, he had stopped asking her how she felt, stopped checking in the way he once did. They had drifted not out of lack of love, but lack of communication. And neither of them had noticed until the space between them became wide enough to scare him into writing a letter. Jessie leaned against the wall and spoke softly, telling her she didn't have to decide anything right now. He said Eric wasn't asking for solutions. He was asking for honesty, for a conversation where both of them admitted their fears rather than hiding behind politeness. Claire appreciated the way Jessie phrased it simple, direct, without pressure. She looked from one friend to the next, seeing how much they cared not just for Eric, but for her as well. It reminded her of all the times they had supported her in small ways, like helping fix the fence last summer or bringing over groceries when she caught the flu. Their loyalty wasn't just to Eric. It was to their entire circle. She glanced at the letter again, reading the last lines where Eric had written that he didn't want to lose the softness they once shared. He wrote that she was still the person he wanted to come home to, but he didn't know if she felt the same. Claire pressed the letter to her lap, feeling a quiet determination forming beneath her fear. She knew she needed to talk to him, not through a message or a letter or his friends, but face to face. And she didn't want to wait for him to return from Toronto. She needed to tell him she wasn't leaving, she wasn't drifting, she wasn't giving up. But before she could speak her thoughts out loud, the room shifted again. Daniel's phone buzzed, and when he looked at the screen, his eyes widened. He didn't speak at first, which only made Claire's heartbeat rise again. When he finally looked up, his face held something between disbelief and urgency. "Claire," he said, "you need to hear this." The room grew still again, every breath held in place, as Claire waited for whatever came next, knowing somehow that the next words would change everything even more than the letter had. Asterisk. Claire's heart skipped as Daniel looked at her with wide eyes, his phone still in his hand, and she felt a cold rush of anticipation flood through her chest. Whatever news he had seemed urgent, something that couldn't wait even for her to process the letter fully. She gripped the edge of the couch, her knuckles whitening. The three friends exchanged quick glances that made her realize this was bigger than she thought. Before she could ask, the familiar sound of the front door opening stopped her words in their tracks, and she froze. There, standing on the porch, dripping from an unexpected drizzle,
was Eric.
His coat clung to him, and his hair stuck to his forehead. But it was his eyes, wide and raw, that made her chest tighten. He looked exhausted but determined, like someone who had run through storms just to reach a place he couldn't leave behind. Claire couldn't speak at first, 1,000 thoughts colliding in her mind. Why hadn't he left with the flight? Why hadn't he called her directly? And why was he here now, standing in the rain, waiting for her? She felt a surge of relief mingled with frustration. The letter, the friends, the worry, they were all leading up to this moment. And now he was here, finally facing everything. Eric's voice broke the silence, low and urgent, carrying all the emotions that had been trapped in writing until now. "Claire," he said, and the single word seemed to hold months of fear, regret, and longing. "I couldn't get on that flight. I couldn't leave things like this." She felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness, yet they were anticipation, hope, and a quiet ache. Her hands trembled as she moved closer, unconsciously reaching for the comfort of someone she had missed so deeply. Eric's gaze didn't waver. It held her, anchored her, and for the first time since reading his letter, she felt the intensity of his presence, the weight of his fear and love all in one look. She could see that he had run from his fear of confrontation, of saying the wrong thing, of making her feel distant. But he had come anyway, because he couldn't bear to leave the space between them unspoken. Daniel, Mark, and Jessie subtly stepped back, giving them room, but staying close enough that Claire could feel the silent support surrounding her. They didn't speak, but their presence reminded her that love sometimes needed witnesses. People who cared deeply enough to make sure neither partner felt alone. Claire's voice finally emerged, trembling but firm. "You sent your friends to check on me," she asked, half accusing, half relieved, unsure if she should be laughing, crying, or shouting. Eric shook his head, rain dripping from his hair, and his words tumbled out, rushed and honest. I was scared you wouldn't open the door. I didn't know if you'd even listen to me. I thought, maybe with them you'd feel safe enough to hear me. Her chest tightened as she realized how much vulnerability he was showing. She had always admired Eric's steadiness, but now she saw the cracks, the uncertainty, the raw humanity that made her love him even more. She stepped closer, needing to bridge the gap that the storm, the letter, and the distance had created. I've been scared too, she admitted, voice breaking slightly. Scared we've been drifting without noticing. Scared that maybe we've forgotten how to reach each other. Eric reached for her hands, holding them with a desperation that made her feel like they were lifelines rather than just gestures. We can't fix everything overnight, he said, voice trembling. I don't expect us to. But I need to hear you, and I need you to hear me. I don't want to lose what we have, Claire. Not now, not ever. The rain outside intensified, but inside the living room felt like a bubble where time had paused, where nothing mattered except the two of them and the fragile thread reconnecting their hearts. Claire's thoughts raced, remembering every moment of distance. Every sigh she had thought he hadn't noticed. Every night she had gone to bed feeling alone. All of it culminated in this single instant. Standing inches apart, hands intertwined, and a shared realization that love was not about perfection, but about persistence. About showing up even when fear wanted to push them apart. Daniel shifted slightly, clearing his throat gently. Not to interrupt, but to remind them that support was still present, that they weren't facing this alone. Mark nodded in quiet solidarity, and Jessie offered a small, encouraging smile. Their eyes said without words, "We're here because we care, because this matters." Claire finally allowed herself to exhale a long, trembling breath that seemed to carry months of unsaid words. She looked at Eric, his soaked hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes filled with worry and hope, and she knew she couldn't stay angry. The fear and tension melted into relief and love. I never stopped, she whispered, her voice soft but sure. Eric pulled her into a hug that felt like the answer to every doubt. Every worry, every tear they had shared separately in silence. She could feel the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against hers. And for the first time in days, maybe even weeks, she felt safe. But just as she was beginning to settle into the quiet intimacy of that embrace, a sudden sound from the window made her flinch. A flash of lightning, followed by the low rumble of thunder, so close it seemed to shake the house. The lights flickered, and before she could react, the room plunged into darkness. Eric tightened his hold on her instinctively, murmuring her name while the three friends moved quickly, sounding like a team ready to respond to any emergency. Claire's breath caught, and she realized that the physical darkness mirrored the emotional uncertainty still lingering in the room. She could feel Eric's heartbeat, strong but nervous, and she could sense the unspoken question between them. What comes next? Her fingers found his hands in the dark, gripping tightly, holding on to what was real. And as the room adjusted to the shadows, she understood that this moment, filled with fear, love, and anticipation, wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a conversation they had both been avoiding. In the quiet darkness, the rain outside, and the flickering shadows cast by lightning, Claire and Eric were finally present with each other in a way that demanded honesty, demanded courage, and demanded love. The three friends quietly taking up positions around the room with soft gestures of care. A blanket here, a flashlight, there reminded Claire that love was supported not just by two hearts, but by the hands and hearts of those who truly cared. And even as the storm outside raged, the small, dark living room became a place of raw connection. The first step toward rebuilding the intimacy that had been tested by fear, distance, and silence. Claire held Eric tighter, feeling both the uncertainty and the hope, knowing that, whatever came next, they would face it together with support, honesty, and the recognition that love required courage, presence, and the willingness to confront the storms, literal and emotional, that sometimes swept through life without warning. The darkness in the living room made Claire's heart race, but she felt Eric's steady hands on hers. grounding her even as the storm outside rattled the windows. The sudden blackout had turned an already tense moment into something almost magical, and she realized she could feel every beat of his heart against her own. Hear the quiet inhale and exhale and sense the raw honesty in his presence. Around them, Daniel, Mark, and Jesse moved with calm efficiency, lighting candles, handing over flashlights, and draping a blanket across Claire's shoulders. Their movements were subtle but purposeful, a silent reminder that even in the chaos, she was not alone, that the people who loved them both were willing to support them without stepping into the intimacy that belonged only to Claire and Eric. She felt a sudden swell of gratitude for them, not just for Eric, but for the friends who had come to bridge the gap that fear and miscommunication had created. Eric's voice broke the quiet, low and full of emotion, as he said, "I can't fix what's between us without listening to you, without understanding what you feel. I need you to tell me, Claire, what's real for you." Her throat tightened, and she realized that she had been holding back for too long, afraid that admitting the cracks in their relationship would make them worse. But now she understood it was the exact opposite. She needed to let him in, and he needed to let her in, so they could rebuild what had been strained by distance and pride. She looked up at him, finally meeting his gaze, and the words tumbled out, rushed but honest. "I've been scared, Eric. Scared that maybe you were slipping away. Thought I was slipping away? That we were losing the connection that made us us. I love you. I always have. But I didn't know how to show it when life felt heavy, when everything felt like too much." Eric nodded, relief and emotion flooding his face, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. "I love you too, Claire. I never stopped. But I let my fears build walls instead of bridges, and I didn't want to hurt you while trying to fix myself." The three friends moved closer, but they did not intrude. Daniel handed Claire a warm cup of tea, Mark adjusted a candle to brighten the corner of the room, and Jessie silently offered a reassuring look. Each gesture reminded her that love often required not just a people, but a community willing to hold space, to support, and to witness when hearts were vulnerable. The rain outside continued, but inside, the warmth from the candles, the soft light, and the closeness of Eric made the room feel safe, almost sacred. Claire's chest swelled with a mix of emotion, relief and longing as she leaned into Eric, letting the tears fall freely now, not of fear but of release, of the tension and distance evaporating in the quiet intimacy of their reunion. "We can find our way back," Eric whispered, "but only if we promise to stay present, to talk, to share the small things before they become the big things that scare us apart." She nodded, gripping his hands tightly, knowing that she wanted nothing more than to promise that, knowing it would take work, honesty, and patience, but feeling ready to commit to the journey because the love they shared was worth every challenge. The three friends stepped back slightly, giving them space, yet their presence was a comforting shield, a reminder that sometimes love and marriage were strengthened not just by romance, but by support, loyalty, and care from those who had seen them both grow. Claire realized that letting them in earlier wasn't just about receiving help. It was about recognizing that relationships were never in isolation, that love could be protected, nurtured, and healed with honesty and community. She looked around the room, taking in the soft candlelight, the steady presence of Eric, the small gestures from Daniel, Mark, and Jesse, and she understood that the shocking part of the evening wasn't that her husband's friends had come. It was that their arrival had created a space where she and Eric could finally face their fears together. She felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth spreading through her chest, knowing that even in moments of darkness, love could shine if nurtured with honesty, attention, and courage. Eric gently pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers, and whispered again, "We'll get through this together, always." Her lips trembled as she smiled, tears still sliding down her cheeks, feeling a deep sense of relief and hope that they could rebuild the closeness that had been tested but never broken. Outside, the rain continued, but the sound no longer scared her, became a rhythm to match the beating of her heart, steady and strong, reminding her that storms, literal or emotional, were temporary and love, when tended, endured. Claire finally let go of the tension she had carried for days, weeks, maybe months, and allowed herself to simply be present with Eric, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the sincerity in his words, and the renewed connection that the storm, the blackout, and the shared vulnerability had created. The three friends quietly stepped toward the door, one by one, offering nods and smiles, giving Claire and Eric the intimacy to speak without interference, but leaving the support palpable. A silent promise that they were always there if needed. Claire watched them leave, her heart full, understanding that letting them in had not weakened her marriage, had strengthened it, showing her that love sometimes needed witnesses, allies, and small acts of care to survive the moments when fear and distance threatened to pull two hearts apart. As the final candle flickered, casting soft shadows on the walls, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She was not alone, her marriage was not lost, and love had not abandoned her. She turned to Eric, their hands still entwined, and smiled through her tears. "We'll be okay," she whispered, her voice full of certainty. He nodded, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. The kind of kiss that carried reassurance, love, and the promise of new beginnings. In that small, candlelit living room, with the storm raging outside but calm settled within, Claire realized that love was not just a feeling, it was a choice, an effort and a presence, one that they had both chosen to honor again. The night stretched on, filled with quiet conversation, laughter, and shared confessions. A reaffirmation that hearts could reconnect if given honesty, courage, and unwavering care. And as the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, Claire and Eric held each other close, ready to face whatever storms might come next. Together, their love deeper, their connection stronger, and their hearts more open than they had ever been before.